Awesome. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning and kicking off NFMT. We're really excited to share today's subject matter. But yes, without further ado, the reason why you're all here, today we're going to be covering how your organization can achieve lifecycle asset management, and we'll discuss a scalable approach to global data standardization. So quickly, I'll just cover the agenda that we will be covering today. We'll introduce the speakers briefly, and then we'll get right to the top questions for each organization. Now, keep in mind, we want this conversation to be as engaging as possible. So as we're going through the questions today, if anyone does have a question, or if there's something particular that's asked about JLL, Greph, or CAM code that you want to share with the audience, feel free and raise your hand, and I'll get to you. And with time permitting, we'll address that whole question. If for whatever reason the question does go over, then we'll answer that offline after the presentation. So today we're going to be covering some best practices on data hierarchies to help assist you in your standardization efforts. We'll also address how you can identify some data gaps in your inventory. We'll discuss some crucial KPIs to achieve database accuracy, and then we'll provide some considerations to help you select the ideal asset tag for your data collection efforts. As Mark said before, I'm Brett Banco, Marketing Manager with Horizons Incorporated, and today we've got some really dynamic speakers in front of you today, and we'll start things off with Lou Peoples, CMMS Consultant with CamCode. Lou, tell us a little bit about yourself and provide some context for the audience and how we can help today.
Yeah, I've been helping organizations with barcode asset tracking for about 32 years, so I've got a lot of experience with what folks like you are doing, and anxious to share some of those experiences with you.
Awesome, thanks, Lou. And next up, we have David Govin, Global Asset and Preventative Maintenance Lead with JLL Amazon's Graph account.
Yeah, no, basically what I am is the translator between tech and operations. What we do is we build the technology, put it into a format that's replicable, scalable, and then apply it and customize it with configurations to kind of make it so everybody from both ends of the organization can work together to answer the questions what you need to ask.
Awesome. And last but not least, we have Jeff Manis, National Practice Leader for JLL's Environmental and Property Condition Services.
Nice to meet you all. So I run the team in the Americas that performs various engineering services. One of our core global functions, though, is asset tagging and data collection. So we oversee the programs that perform all the tagging and data capture across our clients' locations globally.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. So we'll kick things off now with CAM code. How's that sound, Lou? All right, so one of the questions that you're often asked that I'm sure everybody in here wants to learn the answer to is, with your labeling, should I use a sequential data or asset-specific data capture?
I get that question answered a lot, but first let me find out, maybe by a show of hands, who doesn't understand how a barcode works relative to integrating with your software to track assets. Does anybody need an explanation of how that works? Good, everybody's okay. So both methods accomplish the same thing. At the end of the day, the goal is to allow the user to access the record in your database very quickly with 100% accuracy, and that's what tagging does. When we talk asset-specific data, it's not often used in the facilities environment, but what that means is that the serial number that we encode in the QR code, which is a type of barcode, it's pre-assigned before manufacturing the label. So that means that you as a user are 100% confident in your database that it's very accurate, and this way you can make the tags because those tags are assigned to specific assets, and that's the negative of the whole thing as well. On one hand, you can have descriptions in your label that says HVAC 1, HVAC 2, HVAC 3, so it maybe helps your text, things like that. But from an installation point of view, it's a lot more expensive because you have to match the correct asset with the correct label. When we use sequential data, for example, I make labels 1 through 1,000. When you go to install the tag, you're either creating your database or open up the record for that asset. You would simply grab a label out of the bag, number 5, for example, and at that point associate it with the asset at that point, and then from then on it becomes its license plate, just like the license plate on your car. When the police stop you, once they type in that number and up comes your record very quickly. That accomplishes the same thing. The benefit there is that installation is much, much faster, and you're able to purchase extra labels for, say, the following year at volume pricing, because the labels are typically all volume, that's a big factor in the cost. And as you add 1 or 2 assets a day, a month, whatever you do, grab the next label out of the bag, put it on, associate it, and off you go. You have something that works. So it works well that way.
So drilling down a little bit further, I know that there are a lot of ways that you can customize your label, but obviously time and space is fleeting. So when should I use a web URL versus just a serial number?
Sure. So at the end of the day, again, both accomplish the same thing. They're linking that asset to the asset, right, to your label. When you use just a serial number, and that's, for example, 00001, and nothing else that's encoded in the QR code, typically you have to have your software app installed on your smartphone or tablet. And to access the record for that asset, you have to open up the software app, and within the app, scan the label. That serial number then means something because it's associated with the asset. If you scan that without the app being open, you would simply, and for example, you open up your camera and it opens it up, reads that number in Safari or Chrome, it's just reading that number. If it's 7 digits, as a matter of fact, it'll probably think it's a phone number. When you use a URL encoded in the QR code, what that allows you to do is scan that label from your camera through Safari or Chrome, and you're opening up a web-based version of that software. You would log in. At that point, there's some sort of login process, and then you can access the same record, except it's web-based instead of application-based. That's the big difference. There's 2 things you got to consider there. Number 1, if you're using URLs, it kind of locks you into the software, because once it's encoded in the QR code, you can't change it. Where if you just have serial numbers, if you decide to move to another software vendor, it works the same way. So you can actually change vendors that way if you really needed to. That's really the big difference. The other thing you can do with URLs, of course, is link it to various other things like manuals, training videos, parts ordering, things like that for users. And I've even had some customers have two QR codes on the same label, one going to the application for that asset, the other one possibly for trouble reporting or, like I say, parts ordering, things like that.
Awesome. Thanks, Lou. Jeff, would love to hear your perspective on this. How do organizations ensure the accuracy and integrity of their asset data and information within their systems?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a loaded question. My team's exposure to data typically comes in a few different stages, right? One, the first stage is if we collect the data new. If we're capturing the registry data, which is the foundational first time it's been collected, versus if the data already exists in the CMMS, the registry's already there, but it's fairly new being about a year after it's been collected by someone that did tagging and registry creation, versus data that's been existing in the system that's been used for a couple of years. And the reason I make those distinctions between those different phases is that every touch point on data becomes an opportunity for data degradation. And it doesn't really matter if it's, and this is from our exposure, right, that we work with our clients all over the globe with all their locations, all their assets. So this is a pretty objective perspective. I'm saying this, that data degrades, and it happens like that. It happens if there is no governance, if there is no uniform policy in place about touching assets, how you're using the data associated, how you're logging into them, how you're entering, functions of work orders against these assets. If you have no plan for equipment transition, decommissioning assets, replacing them, there's literally every touch point becomes an opportunity for degrading your data. So we typically recommend when we're doing a new asset tagging data collection event that you've got to invest at the same time in a policy that continues your data quality, whether it's internally, if you have a governance program that includes a playbook, that includes some sort of training that you can hand out to your national team that says for every person that's touching, logging into this asset using this software, whatever CMMS you have to do it in a uniform way with governance standards in place. And you'd be surprised the number of organizations we work with that don't have this. They could spend $5 million, which is not uncommon for global occupiers, on doing a data collection event up front. Year 2, we come back and we look at that data. It's gone from about 100% down to 75% data quality. And we start seeing different things, like equipment is replaced, it's not logged, the data's incomplete, it's, you've got 13 alphanumeric characters on a piece of equipment, the way they've been captured is wrong, they've been entered incorrectly. Every touch point becomes an opportunity for data degradation. So having an SOP, a governance process, and then really providing, it's almost like an insurance policy too on the quality of your data, making sure that you're investing not just in this capture event, but in the long-term, care of that data. That's where it's absolutely critical that you don't look at it as a one and done. You look at it as, hey, we're investing in a solution. We got to budget this over the term of, this new process that we're using.
That's great. Thanks, Jeff. And David, in terms of the importance of standardization, really want to hear your perspective and understand what are some of the benefits of implementing a standardized asset naming convention within an organization?
Yeah, it breaks down to you set your foundation, so when you look at a naming convention, you can pull out whatever information, whether it's geographical, where you are on the planet. So what happens is you set that baseline foundation. So when you look at that convention, you can definitely see what you're dealing with, what you're working on, where you are in the building. It could be and then thinking bigger and scaling it out, you can kind of see on the graphic, you start all the way to the left in your timeline. When you set that foundation in yellow, it branches off and leads to other strategic things. So you can add in strategy, you can add in other activities that build off of that initial foundation. So starting off on the right path is it's fundamental. It's one of those fundamental things you have to get right.
And in terms of fundamentals, can you share some best practices for developing some of those asset naming conventions that are scalable and easy to maintain? That could probably take up an entire session, but.
Yeah. No, well, let's keep it simple. Whenever who are the people that are going to be looking at these naming conventions? You have your building operators, your vendors, could be procurement. Make it easy. Have where you are, so what building you're going to be in. You can break it down into what other levels you have, from floors, spaces, rooms, types of rooms, functions of the rooms, whether it's electrical or is it in a data center. Are there special criticality functions that need to flag out? Possibly if you're working global, you deal with a lot of different cultures and language barriers. So keeping them alphanumeric might be a little bit easier so every culture can understand. You might have somebody in Latin America is looking at tags or naming conventions in Europe, and making that structure to where everybody understands. And this is the most critical piece, as Jeff talked about, is that governance or those SOPs or any documents, making definitions for what you're doing. So here you see kind of like a configuration code. You can make it as complex as you want, as long as you want, provided you can fit it on a tag that, we will kind of get to in a little bit. But making it simple, defining it, and then making the information accessible through So anybody can pick it up in the room and understand what they're looking at.
So David, we know that consistency is key as you've been reiterating here, but how important is consistency in asset data structures and naming conventions? And this could stem across different technologies and systems used within an organization. I know that at Amazon you have various systems, technologies, stakeholders, et cetera. So would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, first thing is understanding what questions you're gonna be asking, and then go to your key stakeholders and understand, hey, what information do I wanna get out of that asset before you even start building a standardization? Understanding what repositories or sources of truth there are, and maybe your CMMS system isn't the best place to store that information. Maybe you want to pull or have things. So you have CMMS data that is going to be in your operations wing. Maybe you have construction and development in another one where it could be your project management software. So once you define where your sources of truth are, then any of the standardized practices between them, you can link all of those through visualizations, and it's very easy. But here's the hard part is making sure all of your naming conventions, data points, what information you want to capture on your assets, you need to make sure you know where to find it in each repository, and then have that universal translator between them to be able to say, hey, stakeholders, this is what we got. Here's the lay of the land. You want to pull off project management data. This is the repository we go to. This is the data point name that we're going to pull from. So we'll have that information. So we got project manager, project number, project there. How do you tie it to your CMMS operations system saying, hey, I'm building a building over in Seattle, but I want to know when it's coming online and when I receive the asset data coming in. How do I find that in my CMMS system? Well, you have to link them. And that linking and that strategy is how you do it between those databases. And it's all back to the fundamentals. Know where your data is, know what repository is the source of truth. And, it's the same way you wouldn't listen to a friend of a friend, go right to the source. It's the same way with data. Just think of it, data and operations are linked, and you want to create that common link between assets. So tying one asset attribute to other databases, that's where you make that bond. So the more bonds you have, the more reliable the data is, but anytime you make a change, it's not change to one thing, your change management practices and governance, you need to make sure you change everything downstream.
That's great. Thank you, David. Well, while we're on this topic, Jeff, would love to hear JLL's perspective on how you would go about calculating the ROI for an investment in a CMMS or IWMS system. And if we're going to expound upon that, if we could include, software, asset tagging, data collection, and sustainment into the overall piece.
Yeah, this is a really tricky question, and probably one of the most frequent that I get from new clients generally that haven't used or that are just considering using a CMMS, and it's at that point in their growth cycle where they might have a couple of locations, maybe 30, 40, 50,000 square feet, and they're starting to expand. We also see it sometimes with clients that are migrating away from other systems for whatever reason, but calculating that ROI is probably one of the most nebulous things that people have to undertake. And it's easier if you've already had an existing system, because then you can look at data quality. You can say, all right, we got to invest in new quality because our annual CapEx is, off by 20%. We're looking back at our spend on preventative maintenance. It's a mess. We know we have bad quality of data. We've got to replace it. That's one perspective that's kind of easy to use to justify the spend on new asset tagging and data collection. The other one, though, is entirely dependent. If you have a new user coming in saying, how the hell am I supposed to justify a $5 million spend, to do this event? And that's dependent on what type of operation it is even, what type of real estate you occupy, what type of business that you're in. Critical infrastructure is pretty easy, because if you're running to fail and you don't have good data and you need to make the investment, it's easy. If one of your critical systems goes down, if you're telecommunications, for example, and you have reliance on these systems nationally, globally, That's an easy way to figure out. I cannot run to fail. I've got to have data in here that supports, uptime running. That's easy. But if you're like a retailer, for example, or if you're a fast food restaurant, things like having a fryer go down, even though it's very minimal in the scheme of things, has a real tangible impact on the economics of that location for however long that fryer is out of commission. So it's little things like that aggregated over the footprint of your real estate. When you start bringing all these things together, you realize it's not just a fryer in Memphis. It's the potential for fryers across, 8,000 locations in the US, a couple of our clients. It's that kind of aggregation and those economics that immediately say, okay, there's something real and tangible here. And then you've got to kind of figure out those pieces with whatever type of footprint you occupy, with whatever type of business you're in, putting it into tangible. David and I were just talking a minute ago about FF&E. We have clients that come to us and ask us, hey, can you tag all of our fixtures and furnishings and equipment, all of that stuff? And I was saying to David a minute ago, like, what is the ROI? How do you calculate that on chairs and tables? That's a lot more nebulous to me, because it's not income producing. It's things that your occupiers have to sit in, they have to work on. But how do you calculate that? David's response to me was, one of the more simple ways to do this is to consider the second life opportunity with chairs and tables and TVs and cabinets and literally things like that that are tangible in your spaces. If you have a organizational ESG charter that has some sort of sustainability goal, second life of your equipment becomes a very easy ROI, like actually very low-hanging fruit to meet sustainability goals that feed into corporate ESG charters. So it's really finding whatever that metric is that is meaningful to your organization is the key component of this. There is no silver bullet answer to ROI, like how do you calculate this? It is entirely dependent on your organization finding the key metrics that make sense. And once you have that, our team has a lot of experience helping different organizations, different types of asset volume, calculating these things. We do that every day as well, just to help you back into numbers that help justify the cost of the investment that you make.
Great. Thank you for sharing that context, Jeff. And Lou, on the barcoding side of things, when we're talking about tagging the physical assets, can you describe what some of the differences are between a QR code and a linear barcode in the event that some of the audience members aren't aware? And when should each of those be used?
Sure. First of all, just by matter of definition, everybody knows what a QR code is. A linear barcode is like the picket fence kind of barcode. I'll call it an old style. Still very usable, but it looks like a picket fence, and typically those are either code 128 or code 39, which are the names. Probably 99%, 100% of what I do today over the last 5 years, it's always been QR codes, and really the difference is what is your software able to scan with, and today everybody's software uses QR codes, but I do get asked a lot about linear barcodes. And one of the issues with the linear barcode is as you add characters or numbers to the barcode, it takes up space. So every character is made up of bars and spaces. So as you add those, it makes the label wider. And what happens is the symbol becomes wider, therefore your label becomes wider and becomes more costly because of that. A QR code, on the other hand, takes up less space. You can use either a smaller label or put other things on the label as well, such as your logo, instructions, scan for service, things like that. The other problem with a linear barcode is that as you, especially if you're in a food environment or harsh environment, as if you get contamination like specks of food or dirt, or you gouge the label, it just won't scan, or you get misreads. Instead of an A, it scans as an O, just because it's the combination. A 2D symbol, and you can see on the chart here, you can damage up to 30% of that symbol, and it'll still scan. So it's a very robust way to put on a label and track your assets.
Great, thanks, Lou. And while we're talking about asset tagging, Jeff, On your end, or a JLL's perspective, what are some of the challenges that you commonly encounter when you're implementing asset tagging systems? And if you could, provide some ways that, some of our attendees might be able to overcome some of their challenges.
I think there's two key things that become challenges until you've got deployment of a program. And those are really the execution, how you're going to perform that event, and the budget associated with that. And those are kind of two in the same types of issues, because like typically when we provide a price to do something, we budget it based on labor rates and costs of sending our team or using local teams. But it's based on complexity of your real estate and the assets in those systems. So if we need to send architects and engineers to perform that collection versus if you're a fast food chain, complexity is a little bit less with fryers and ovens and grinders and things like that. So first, we scale it like that, but even when we do that, our costs are usually a little bit higher, I think, than our clients expect to spend on this. So they get the budget perspective and they say, oh, I didn't think this was going to be that pricey or that time consuming or that whatever it is. So they take that and then they look at execution options. And typically this comes down to their on-site personnel, because they don't really have another option, especially in a global footprint. JLL's in every developed country of the world. We've got local offices everywhere. We can tap into scale. We can do things that other occupiers can't, right? So when clients are looking at alternate options of collecting data and tagging, their natural go-to is their on-site personnel. Well, hey, we've got 8,000 locations in the US, all those locations have a manager. We're going to use our managers to do the collection event. Well, don't your managers have a day job? Like, do they just have all this time? Do they have familiarity with tagging? Do they know about, what an RTU is? Do they know all the specs on these things that our people are trained on? We do this every day. Do they know how to collect this, how the data is going to be used? I mean, I don't know how many people in the room can raise their hand and say, yes, our on-site managers all know all that data. We haven't come across any. But what we have come across is our clients that they go down the path and say, we're going to use our on-site managers to collect data, and we're going to force them to do it. It's not part of their day job, but they're going to figure it out. That data comes back, it's about 60 to 50% accurate. There's holes everywhere. And then in those cases, our clients come back to us and say, we kind of screwed up, the data sucks, can you guys go do it? And the cost is the cost. It's not going to change. There isn't going to be a cost savings because you got 50% data accuracy and we're going to drop our cost by 50% because we're just filling holes. It's not the way it works. So the lack of governance associated with using on-site personnel, in some cases it works, right? Because you've got highly skilled technical people in place at these locations, no problem. We've had those types of clients we work with as well, where we create the playbook, we create the governance, and then we oversee the national effort with on-site personnel, no problem. Super high data quality, it works. In the majority of other cases where our clients try to do that, it does not work. And they end up spending, all the time and the headache and the heartache and the time associated, putting them behind timelines there, only to come back to us later and say, we really screwed up. Can you still do this? Can we still be done by, December 31st? And at that point, we usually figure it out. We usually do it. But I'm just saying the governance associated, the budget factor, and the execution are probably two of the biggest headaches. Not headaches, but challenges our clients have to overcome with figuring out how to do this. They are definitely pitfalls in the process.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate you clearing that up. And David, a question that I'm sure that you've had to navigate with Amazon's Graph account is just getting all of this nebulous data together in one uniform, standardized way. So how, in your experience, would you define an effective asset data structure? And are there any key elements that, attendees in the audience should kind of consider as they're putting that together?
Yeah, no, Jeff brought it up. Data is perishable, and it's all about recency. All the devices we have in our hands collect data nonstop, and it turns into a funnel, and it's a constant live stream of analytics going to a structure. So, trying to figure out how you want it to be is you got to learn, do a couple things first. We talked about fundamentals and naming conventions. Well, what kind of answers will get you promoted? What do you want? What do you want to report on to show your value in your organization? That's internally, look at it from there. And then if you telescope out, what does the next layer of leadership want? What does the C-suite want? You're going to see different priorities at all different levels. If you're able to, from your points of view, wherever you sit, understand where you are in the maturity of what you have and what you've built, can be critical of yourself. That's the hardest thing, I think, internally for me as well. Be critical and say, okay, where am I at on this spectrum? What answers can I provide? Let's go talk to a couple different stakeholders that are involved in this. Say, what questions do they want answered? And then you understand that piece, then you go up the channel level and say, hey, I'm going to be kind of putting this thing together. I'm not really sure what we're going to build yet, but I'd love some feedback or an opportunity to understand, hey, what keeps you up at night? What are the big rocks that you want to move out of your way? You hear those things and you start building better questions, and then at the end of it, how can you report on it? What is that report going to look like? All right, you have that piece, and now what you did is you just built a framework that you're going to support with a data structure. It sounds daunting. I'm not a data scientist. Started as a painter, so anybody can do it if you learn how to understand what people want. And we're all in client-facing businesses. Understand what your clients' needs are, and they'll vary. So my solution that we do here at Amazon Graph is different what I would implement previously at T-Mobile or previously at an AT&T. And when you have those conversations, you can scale, you can align your structures to what's important for your clients. And that's it goes back to the same thing. It's communication, client management, feedback response, buy-in, motivation. And then from there, you can kind of build in that data structure. We'll call it a data structure, but really it's just a network that you're building inside your CMMS systems to answer questions, to provide information that'll help the client and also help you at the same time.
That's great. Thanks, David. Jeff, in terms of operators forecasting ahead toward their goals, how on your end would you say that users typically forecast the cost of asset tagging, data capture, and some of the data sustainment work?
Yeah, I think that's kind of one of the meat and potatoes questions we always get ahead of time is, what's this going to cost me? And it ranges anywhere from, if you want to look at it as a per asset type of basis, we could be $9 an asset. We could be, I think in some cases we've seen about $120 per asset. It's based on where the footprint is, the complexity of the assets, security restrictions, requirements. Do we have to work after hours, overnight? Are there, California's, has some challenges working with certain locations there. So there's a lot of complexity about how we price and what the cost is going to be, but on a nut, meat and potatoes type of basis, it could be somewhere between 9 to 120. We also look at that as a per square foot function, your asset density based on the type of real estate you occupy, your organizational operations, who you are, what you do. There's a lot of factors that go into that, and we can pretty easily back into some back of napkin calculations about what it's going to cost to do this. It's not very difficult. Labor rates associated based on complexity, like I mentioned earlier too. If we're sending an architect or an engineer to that location to do that, obviously this person has a higher labor rate than a non-technical person that might be collecting information off of a fryer or a coffee grinder, for example. So, that times the number of hours associated, times the number of assets per day or per hour that our team can collect, efficiencies we can gain. If we don't have to schedule site visits and we can just show up unannounced, there are no security restrictions, we can crush these events. We can come in way under cost, and we do. But understanding what those key metrics are with labor rates to get into your real estate to make these calculations is pretty basic stuff. And once we give our clients kind of the formula, the calculation to figure it out, a lot of times they come back to us and say, hey, I just spec this out back a napkin based on the number of square feet in our portfolio. We think you're going to be about $1 million or 200 grand. And they're usually within, I don't know, 5-10% of what we would calculate. So, and it's at that point too, it's just math. You know, this is defensible, logical math. Nobody's getting ripped off. Nobody's getting, these are just labor rates based on square footages, super easy to calculate.
Oh, thank you, Jeff, for presenting that perspective. And Lou, on your end, when in the midst of a labeling project, who typically uses the barcoded asset tags? Would that be vendors, maintenance staff, a combination of both, some of the above?
Yeah, it's really anybody in the organization that needs to access an assets record. You know, if you have store managers, you know, they're busy working with the public, you know, short staff, things like that. You know, the last thing they want to do is deal with creating a work order, finding the right asset, things like that. So they really need access to the database so that they can scan the QR code, access the record, create the work order, get it to the facility manager, and off you go. If you're just in a building and the facility manager, you know, your HVAC goes out, again, they need to create a work order, scan it, create the work order, go about their business, and it's a process to get it done very quickly. Technical staff, whether they're internal staff or external staff, and you've got to make a decision if you want to have the external staff access your, you know, the database. But again, they need to access it to find that work order so that they can do the PM, whether they're reacting to something that's gone down or if they're just doing preventive maintenance things, because you want them to access the record and record what was done to satisfy that work order on the fly, so it's accurate, it's fresh. They're not doing it at the end of the day or passing the information to somebody else and they enter the information. So you really got to think about, you know, who can really benefit from accessing your record for that asset and give them access, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you for clearing that up, Lou. David, I have another question for you. How can asset data structures and naming conventions support effective reporting and analysis, in addition to driving data-driven decision-making?
Well, it's all about performance. So a lot of, if we're making data-driven decisions, what are we measuring? So we're measuring a couple different things. A common one is performance. How are we performing in the field in operations, and then how are those assets performing in their life cycle? Another one is adherence. You know, you write these business processes like SOPs. If you write a engineering SOP of how you're going to maintain an asset through its life cycle, well, how do you know the effectiveness or adherence? Are people actually using that SOP? You know, these are all like, it seems very trivial, but I get asked that question all the time. Hey, how do you know somebody in India is doing the same thing as somebody in Costa Rica? Well, we have one standard, one global standard we've written, so how do I measure the adherences to those standards? You do it through a set of those analytics and those key metrics, and you're all measuring the same result. It's just how you apply it, you know. And once you kind of line up all those different methods of measuring your performance, measuring your adherence, measuring how your teams are doing in operations, when you get the answers to those questions, then what are you going to do with it? Well, you're going to visualize it. You got to tell a story with a dashboard. You know, it's not an easy thing to do. You have one page that's, you know, roughly the size of your monitor, and how do you track that and tell the story of adherence, performance, and value all in one HTML page? So you got to get a little creative. You got to do a lot of brainstorming and then organize and be thoughtful of what you want to tell. How do you want to tell your story? You know, how are we gonna tell our story to who, and to who? Are we talking to senior level leaders that are making strategic decisions, or are we talking to frontline managers that manage the flow of production, you know? So understanding your audience, understanding who's gonna use these things, and you might have a combination of things that you have to make multiple visualizations of how you're gonna report.
No, that's great. Thank you, David. And in fact, that kind of concludes all of the questions that we have pre-prepared for today's presentation. So to take kind of a cue from you, David, in terms of asking better questions, if the audience has any questions for, Lou, Jeff, or David, would love to take some now at this point. Sure.
So first of all, that was a good question and answer format. Thumbs up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Then the governance, the C-suite, what they want seems to be a key issue. How much are you seeing people familiar with the ISO 55000 asset management system?
Well, it's used commonly. A lot of people will call it different things. We'll have our own different libraries, but let's call it. I mean, you go to a library anywhere, they catalog the books the same way. They don't really recreate the wheel. So sticking to the ISO system, I mean, yeah, absolutely. You can leverage that globally. Everybody knows what it is. It's a universal standard for the most part. But be deliberate and then make those configurations that will best support what you want to accomplish with what you're building.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else in the audience have a question for our panelists today? Sure.
I was wondering, Jeff, if you could go more into the four-step approach. One of the slides had some information on how to set up the project and kind of walk me through that.
Sure. Let me back up here.
There it is. Yeah. Pretty basic stuff, blocking and tackling, how to set up one of these programs. So we work with our client to understand, like David said, what are your definitions of success with this program? We create a playbook based on those items, come to agreement with our client how they're going to use this data. That playbook becomes the Bible that governs everything we do with that capture event, nationally, globally, whatever. If it's our team that does it, if it's your on-site personnel, we're working from the same playbook. Second step we do there is the alpha test, where we actually pressure test that playbook. We go out to a small group of pilot sites, we use the playbook, we say, 3 disparate groups, 4 disparate groups at a few different locations. We're all working from the same, collective document. We're collecting data based on what's said here. Does it work? We look at the data that comes in through the app, the pictures of the tags. The playbook says everything. Where to put the tag on the device, what data to capture, taking a picture of the asset, a picture of the asset in its environment, picture of the tag on the, so we pressure test it. Does it work, yes or no? If it doesn't work, we make adjustments, we go do a beta test. If it does work, we move to the full deployment of the program. At that point, we're still constantly screening data as it's coming in from all the sites to see, is it conforming to the playbook? I don't know what that was. But the 4-step approach is pretty standard stuff we do, whether we do it or whether we recommend it to our clients. It's kind of one of the keys to success with doing this is having that governance in place, that involves constant oversight, working from a centralized collective document with success defined by all parties.
Great, yeah, thank you for drilling a little bit deeper into that too, Jeff. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
We sounds like a lot about capturing the data of assets that are in existence. Can you guys talk a little bit about capturing the data upfront during installation, requiring contractors to potentially provide the information, and what kind of pitfalls or challenges you've experienced with getting the data while it's being installed?
Yeah, I mean, we're actually going through that yesterday. We're sitting at HQ2 in Arlington arguing over that exact piece. We had 2 launches, HQ2 in Arlington and then also JFK 27 in New York, Manhattan. 2 owned buildings that Gref just I think it was in June, put in place. We're going through the data collection. We did the first pass. We tried to do it internal. Found out it was very difficult. We had processes in place to utilize commissioning agents. I'll be honest, whenever you go through the design and construction of a building, even if you use commissioning agents, even if you scope it into your documents, even if the general contractor knows they have to do it, when it comes time to invoice, they're like, I don't have the manpower because I didn't know I had to take all of that. I couldn't just give you the drawing. I didn't want to have to put it into a spreadsheet that can actually work with your CMMS system. Well, this is what we scoped. This is what we provided you a bid for. You gave us a bid. We accepted it. You said you'd do it. So what do? The building's built. You're not going to go back. So you call your friend Jeff and you say, I got a problem. I don't know what to do. We got totally bound up. And the truth of the matter is, my client is all over my hindside, and we fumbled the data collection for one of the largest builds in history of the company. So what do you just get it done? You know, you go to your network, you leverage what you got, and then you can share your experience there. But it's one of those tough conversations where we go have lunch and probably a happy hour after it's done, and you're like, all right, what's next? You know?
So you guys just ended up having to go collect the data, couldn't get it out of the contractor?
No, it's a common thing, so it's also repeatable. 47 different locations popping up in just US and Canada alone. Add that times global, times other languages. I've had teams fly from the US to Luxembourg, all over North, South America. We were contemplating Japan at one point, you know, and it's a similar thing. Real estate portfolios grow and contract. You also have to worry about the contractions. We talked a lot about return to office. I'm sure it's a very popular topic. When are you hibernating? And when you do hibernate part of your real estate portfolio, how do you track that? Regardless, a floor is an asset in the terms of CMMS. All your CMMS systems, buildings are assets, floors are assets, rooms are assets. So how do you turn them on and off, and what's affected downstream? So dealing with these contractors that come in and do a demise, good luck getting them when they're on the way out the door. I've had a lot of trouble, and I've yet to see an operative model. The only thing I was able to do to drill in performance was building a dashboard that tied assets to real estate developments, and then putting the PM's name next to the data migration. So we were able to build a dashboard to track where it is in the different phases, and then we set milestones on commissioning of systems. And one milestone would be the commissioning of assistance, another one would be the occupancy certificate. You know, you had to be this level complete, and when we started falling behind, interrupting payments is a good way to get the contractor's attention. I don't know if you want to share any.
No, that sums it up for us. You know, we get a call, we say, hey, this ball was fumbled, can you pick it up and run? And we do. And like I said, it doesn't change the fact that some data exists, some data doesn't exist. In a lot of cases, it's harder for us at that point. We got to figure out what's right, what's the record of truth here, what's accurate, what's not. It doesn't change the fact that, you know, we're good at doing those things. We can evaluate it, do the takeoffs, go into the field, collect the data, true it up, and then populate the registry. So it's a process, but that's why we definitely recommend, you know, if you're going to do this, you have people dedicated to doing it, whether it's your people or our people. There's got to be governance around it. I can't stress that enough.
Oh, that's
good
great.
question.
Yeah, that was a great question. We probably still have time for one or two more questions from the audience, so feel free and raise your hand if there is something that you'd like to ask some of our panelists here.
One thing to add on, one thing, our scanner isn't working. So if you want to get scanned for your CEUs, you come to the United States.
If we don't have questions, I'd love to ask you guys one. Oh, go ahead, back.
How do you sell like a barcode system to a company? So like I work for a water district, and so facilities is a very small part of what we do as a water district, and so I'm having a hard time selling, trying to, make a barcode system for all of our facility assets where our CFMS is built around vertical water mains. I'm just wondering if there's a way you guys approach that.
Do you have any clients that?
You know, we do a lot of water districts, and we end up tagging not the facilities, but the assets within your structure that actually processes the water, which is a different animal. The only thing I can say is that, you try to tie that into that same system, because at the end of the day, whether it's a production asset or it's a facilities asset, you're still tracking it. So hopefully you can provide some, can you just include your facilities into the same process if you're not doing that? Or if you're not doing anything, that's how you would do it and I can talk to you offline about a lot of benefits that, I had one customer, Salt River, that showed that they could save time. Like they went from 9 minutes to 30 minutes to finding a work order down to 9 seconds to find that work order, and 100% accuracy. So they were able to save thousands of man hours a year by going through this process, and they should be able to do the same thing with your facilities assets.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great question. We probably have time for one more. Yes, sir.
Along the challenge of getting a new construction into a CMS system, what about the degradation of even minor projects or maintenance of existing systems? How do you balance that? Because there's kind of a scale completely new to medium renovation to minor renovation. Everything's constantly changing.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you get project managers to actually follow up and talk to you? That's the mythical creature. No, it's what I found is you visualize it. So we call them, you can call them any sorts of things, but these additions, you'll have any type of the same thing. Design and construction will come in, modify a space to change occupancy or anything like that. So how do you capture that is through knowing your sources of truth. So if you have your project management software that has that category of whether it's going to be a day one launch of a new building or say a reconstruction or a reconditioning project or a half-life of a building, being able to know your sources of truth, take those and lay them up against the spaces that you have in your CMMS system. So I'm assuming your hierarchy will have building, floor, area, sometimes spaces if you are mature enough in your data to go to actually to the room level. Knowing where the construction is going to happen if you do a multi-tenant and you are taking on a couple extra floors in a lease. Then you have to go in and do the construction to demise it. You make that visualization to where you can track the construction project, lay it up against the CMMS system, and then what you do is you tag your individual asset with the project number or name, and that's how you can watch it if it's in the system. But conversely, what's not in the system? Ask the negative question. Hey, we see everything that's in there, but hey, I'm not seeing anything with this project ID attached to it. How do I link those two and look at, hey, this project has 0 assets. Hunt down your PM and say, where are we at with the asset transfer or the data migration?
That's great. Thank you. And just to bring things to a close, and to reiterate kind of what we covered during today's discussion, we first addressed some best practices on data hierarchies to help you in your standardization efforts. We also pointed out some ways that you can identify data gaps in your inventory. We shared some crucial KPIs to achieve database accuracy. And finally, we provided some considerations to help you select the ideal asset tag for your data collection efforts. Obviously, we know that these conversations are going to be ongoing, and if there are any questions specific for the panelists that you have offline, You can see us at booth 842 with any questions, and we'll do our best to answer those. We would also really appreciate if you could fill out the session survey in the NFMT event app. But aside from that, we hope that you found this session productive and hope that the rest of NFMT is also productive for you guys. Thank you.